Hello, everybody. Wow, I hope everybody can hear me. It looks like we're about to go live. Dun, 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 live at theonering.net. I'm checking everything here. There's lots of shadows. The lights are not quite as studio bright as I would like them to be. So sorry, everybody. Welcome to our live show. And as always, this is Torn Tuesday, being theonering.net, live Tuesday every Tuesday at 5 p.m., coming from Los Angeles. And this is our live stream show that we do every week, usually co-hosted by the two of us, Justin and myself, Clifford Broadway, longtime contributor and writer, and sometimes man about town for The One Ring. And now we're very excited to have a special live stream. All of you guys joining us, we're live on Periscope, Ustream, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook Live. Thank you for being with us, because we're having a very special show with a special guest. He's a remarkable fellow, really remarkable fellow, and his name is Doug Adams. Okay, not to be confused with the other Doug Adams. We made that joke earlier on Twitter today, but he's not the author of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Indeed, our fabulous fine-feathered friend, Doug Jones, is the author of a very different book, The Music of Middle-earth. Did I say Jones? Listen, Justin, there's the voice of my producer in my ear reminding me that I have just gone into this place of thinking about Doug Jones from The Shape of Water. Thank you. I know the name of the film. Not only Doug Jones from The Shape of Water, but I accidentally said that. I didn't mean to do that. But this is just an incredible show. Doug Adams, you can find him on Twitter at Doug Adams Music, and he is quite the authority on his book, The Music of the Lord of the Rings films, is just fantastic. He's a very, very talented man who has been featured at Dragon Con and other major conventions around the country, speaking about Howard Shore's breathtaking and shall we say, legacy-building music around Peter Jackson's 6 films. So, without further ado, thank you, everybody, for being with us. We're going to give a call right now to Doug Adams and have him come on and be on the show with us. Excuse me while I make accidental references to Doug Jones. It's hilarious. It's because I've interviewed Doug Jones on this very show right here. And he's a good friend of ours. He's a ringer and a friend. And there is Doug Adams himself being brought in via amazing technology. We've called him in. Thank you, Justin, our producer behind the scenes, has set this up. Hi, I can see you. Hello, sir. How are you?
How's it going?
Where are you at tonight, Mr. Doug Adams?
I'm fine. How are you?
Great. I'm really great. Where are you calling from tonight? Where's your home?
I'm in the Chicago area.
Oh, so, Chicago area. Right. Okay, cool.
Snow and sleet and fog and every other miserable thing right now, but it's Chicago. That's okay.
You poor, poor people. Because here in Los Angeles, we've had, except for today with the massive rain we had today, but we've had 71 degrees and sunny for the past few snowstorms. Every blizzard you've dealt with in the past few days, we've had a sunny day. It's amazing.
We made it above freezing, I think, for the first time in 2 weeks, but January, Chicago, can't help it.
Best thing, having lived in Chicago for 9 years, I can say I don't envy you a bit. I have very fond memories of Chicago and all the areas around. I had friends in Schaumburg. I had friends in Crete. I had friends in Oak Park. I had friends in Evanston. Actually, I worked all around the suburbs around Chicago. I know the area, but I do not miss those bloody, bloody winters. I do not miss those winters at all.
It should be over in about 4 or 5 months, so I'm sure it'll be fine.
Prince wrote a song once called "Sometimes It Snows in April," and being from the Minneapolis, Minnesota area, and not so far from Chicago, he knew this is true. He knew that was quite true.
It's very true. Yes, sad.
Crazy. You look healthy. You look warm and comfortable in your beautiful home. And Doug, it's good to have you on the air. Welcome.
Thank you. Yes, fantastic. Hi, everybody. I can't see all the questions, but I'm sure they'll be related. So,
There's going to be, and this is called a little bit of house cleaning. We're going to do station identification once again, and I'm going to explain to the folks at home how the format of our show is going to work tonight. So once again, if you're just tuning in live, welcome to the OneRing.net live stream every Tuesday. We call it affectionately Torn Tuesday. And I'm your host, Clifford Broadway, sometimes referred to as Quick Beam, online as my handle at the One Ring. And this excellent fellow who's here on the side of the screen with me is Doug Adams, and he's the author of the music of the Lord of the Rings films, and he is quite the musician and scholar himself. And we're going to get into some nitty-gritty about Howard Shore's amazing work. And all your questions, please bring them to us. We can see your questions if you text us live on my phone at this hotline that's floating across the screen, 530, number 6, number 4, FRODO. That's 530-64 Frodo. For Frodo. And then, if you want, you can also chat right there in that live screen with Justin and on Facebook. And he's going to be the invisible man behind the curtains that you don't pay any attention to. But he'll be reading chat questions live as well. So take part with us. Bring your questions to Doug and myself. And let's get this show on the road. So, look, the hotline is already blowing up, Doug. We're already getting messages here.
oh, good.
All right, someone's texting us about the old Ustream chat. Justin, he'll have to face those technical questions a little later when the show is over. But I'm really glad to see you, good friend. I've appeared with you together at conventions and lots of interesting events. Weren't you at the Fantasy Con in Salt Lake City a number of years ago?
I was, yeah. About 4 years ago this summer, I think, something like that.
Oh, how time flies.
Yeah, I know.
And you've been at Atlanta, the illustrious and huge over-the-top event of Dragon Con. You've been there quite a few times as well, haven't you?
Been all over the place, yeah.
Isn't it crazy? You've been to England as well?
Oh, yeah. We've done a lot of stuff in Europe over the years. It's been great.
Tell the folks a little bit about your CV, for those of you who don't know yet. And by the way, not just a plug, but seriously, guys, if you're a Tolkien fan and you love what Howard Shore has created and appreciate the depth of what he's done, this man right here has the book for you. You've got to get yourselves a copy of the music of the Lord of the Rings films. Now, go ahead, Doug. Tell us about some of your excursions into the world of fandom.
Sure. Well, I mean, it all came about thanks to Howard Shore. When I was in college, I was writing for a magazine on film, television, music called Film Score Monthly, and I was kind of the one, I was a music student. I was studying music at the time, so I was the one guy that had musical background that they would give a lot of these composer interviews to. So I'd met Howard Shore that way, doing interviews on all sorts of other various projects. I think the first time I spoke to him was on the, the Sylvester Stallone thing, Copland, I think.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I had forgotten that he was involved with that.
Well, a long time ago. Years are getting past us here. So Howard and I continued talking past that, and we'd always do the interview and sort of chat for a little while after the interview on what have you heard, what have you seen, and we're both great fans of all the forms of the arts, and I always kind of jokingly say that his Canadian temperament and my Midwestern American temperament got along quite well, so we were with one another. He'd call, I was still living at home in grad school, he'd call and get my parents on the phone sometime. But in 2001, when he was working on a film, a Frank Oz directed film called The Score, in this case about a heist, not necessarily music, but Howard had done the music for that. And at the end of that, I knew that he had signed on to Lord of the Rings, but tried to keep it very cool and professional and didn't bring it up. And he brought it up himself, said, I've just signed on to this Lord of the Rings thing. I said, yeah, I know.
Oh, really? Okay. Did he say it as nonchalantly as that? I just signed up for this Lord of the Rings thing.
Yeah,
that reminds me of the conversation when I met him one night, and he said, at the Oscar party, he said, Wagner was an incredible anti-Semite. I'm like, okay. And he says these profound things, so he throws them off. It's brilliant. I love the guy.
He's a very smart man.
Sorry, go ahead.
Of course. And I said, yes, of course. I did know that you signed up for that, but I was trying not to bring it up because I'm being professional. And he chuckled and said, well, there's a lot of documentary work going on down here about this, and this is going to be something bigger than usual. Are you maybe interested in being involved in some way? And I said, yes. And I don't think I slept the entire night, and just had, sugar plum dreams floating around my head of what could this possibly be. And I never imagined anything so wonderful as it ended up to be. I was thinking, well, maybe they'll let me put a paragraph in the CD when it comes out or something like that, in the booklet. And it ended up being far, far beyond that. Within a couple of months, I was out in his studio in New York, going through scores with him and listening to music. And I think Fellowship had just come out, but we were talking about what was coming up in Two Towers. And by the next year, I was getting more information. Eventually, I was invited over to London for the recording sessions for The Return of the King. So I went out there and stayed in the hotel with the production staff, and would take the car up to Watford every day. And
that's amazing. That's just so amazing. Wow.
Sit in the back of the orchestra. So the tearjerker end of the film where, you bow to no one. I'm sitting in that orchestra there as they're playing. I'm not doing anything, but I'm sitting there.
Wow.
And occasionally I sit in the booth, sit between Peter Jackson and Howard Shore, and listen to them discuss what had just been recorded and make their adjustments and so on and so forth. And so that continued on and eventually led to the book. It took a while. We did the complete recordings in the meantime, did all the booklets for that. And then we went ahead and did the book. And then that went into Hobbit territory after that, where I was a little bit more involved. As the films were being made, I was invited to come see everything early so that I could have the liner notes ready to go when the CDs were out around the same time as the film, and was able to do a little bit with some of the documentaries on the Blu-rays and all that sort of thing. So
yes, you did.
Kept on doing. I'm glad I had that conversation back in 2001.
I am too. I mean, if I had been you, I don't think I would have been anywhere near as restrained. You know me, I'm not very restrained anyways, but I would have been busting out all over. It's like Mr. Shore proved himself to be able to develop a good, strong, symbiotic relationship with a certain director before he met Peter Jackson. And everybody knows this is Cronenberg. And there's such a conversation there before we go deep down to the rabbit hole of Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit scores. But it's interesting that you look at a short list of great filmmakers who usually want to have and continue to nurture that one-on-one relationship with certain composers with whom they work best, with whom they have the best kind of results creatively and ongoingly. And that can be struck easily with Tim Burton, his relationship with Danny Elfman. You can see it very clearly with Hayao Miyazaki and his relationship with Joe Hisaishi as well. And that has been one of the most fruitful collaborations in film ever. So looking at Cronenberg and Howard Shore and some of the weird, wonderfully weird and disturbed things that Mr. Cronenberg has given us, it might seem that Howard Shore would not have been a surprise. Maybe it's more surprising than most when you look at it. On that, just scratch the surface and you think, well, Howard Shore's been doing music for all of Cronenberg's psychodramas and all of his weirdness. How on earth is Howard Shore going to, bring that skill set into a tapestry of mythological, epic fantasy when that's really not his wheelhouse? You might think that at first blush. But as it turns out, Mr. Shore is so talented. He's so adaptable, it seems. He could get right in with a new director and start a whole new symbiotic relationship that, again, replicates what I was mentioning in that example, and finding such a good tick-tock, day-to-day mechanism working with Peter and all the guys on the team. Did you find that true, that Howard has that kind of flexibility to go where the story is going to go, regardless of all the stuff on his own resume, what he's used to doing, right?
Well, I think he's one of the most flexible composers in the industry. I mean, in addition to the incredibly fruitful collaboration with Cronenberg, he was also doing things like Mrs. Doubtfire.
Yeah, that's right. As a matter of fact, he did that too.
Yes. He was, for the first several films, David Fincher's composer of choice, but then he was also, way back earlier in his career, he was the first band leader on Saturday Night Live for 5 seasons. So he had an incredibly varied resume.
I had forgotten that. I had forgotten, indeed. He had been leading the guys on stage at SNL. I had really. Thank you for reminding me.
These wonderful things. Yes.
That's a beautiful nugget. That is a great thing to consider when we're talking about Howard's overall talent. I love it. You know what bothered me most was when King Kong came out and there were rumors of some kind of grief or some kind of upset, a disturbance in the force, for lack of a better term. And all of a sudden we're like, really? Peter was going to go so far as to replace all of Howard's music with, what was it? Who was the composer
that eventually scored it?
That eventually King Kong. I'll look it up.
James Newton Howard.
It was James Newton Howard. Thank you for that. I knew it had 3 names. And thereupon we see that odd moment where Howard Shore has his big cameo in the orchestra pit in King Kong. So his music was removed from the movie because of whatever disagreement they had. But the footage is there. There's still Howard himself living and breathing in the film, which was a beautiful but odd, ironic moment. But I was afraid that they'd never go back to working together again. And I'm glad they did and, have such an agreement. That's just, I love Mr. Howard's work, but I have to say, of all the interesting things he's done, I'm such a fan of his Middle-earth music. It really is like nothing that film history has really had added to it. There's a depth and a layer to it that is supported by the live shows. People love going to these. It stands apart from the film on its own. This work. Right. So let's get down into the nitty gritty. You tell me, Mr. Doug, before we start taking some of these questions from our live viewers, what do you think is the single most defining aspect that makes Howard's contribution to Peter's film work the way they work?
Well, I always think that the nature of music in film is that the music has to contribute something of its own. If it's simply echoing things and reproducing what you get on the screen, it's maybe not as contributory. So I think one of the wonderful things about Howard's music is that it has such a beautifully well thought out and well constructed structure to it. It's good music. It's well-written music. And because of that, it can echo what you see on screen, but bring an additional layer of depth and meaning and subtext and everything else to that. So I think that's part of the reason that Howard's music works so well in film, part of the reason it works so well in literary adaptations, such as Lord of the Rings, and part of the reason that it works so well away from the film, because it also has that innate beauty to it on its own. He eventually landed on this idea that was sort of an operatic idea of using leitmotifs and structuring tons and tons of themes that all fit together and tell the story in their own terms. So as I'm sure the viewers know very, very well, you sit and put on the albums of these of these scores, and you can hear every single occurrence in the narrative simply through the music. Some people, I've even been told, will like to sit and read the books with the music on, the music that pertains to whatever scene they're reading, because the music can also create that direct through line to just Tolkien's writing. You can almost bypass the film if one were so inclined. So I think there's beautiful structure to the music, to the narrative part of it. I think it's just great.
You said the magic word, leitmotifs.
Sure.
That's the magic word. There's anybody who's familiar with Nerd Writer, our friend on YouTube, Evan Pushiak.
Sure.
I think I mispronounced his last name, but God love him. He's done some very intelligent and adroit videos on Howard Shore's work and on how there's a big like video he did on how Helm's Deep is edited and Nerd Writer is a great guy. Watch his videos, and he also does a little discussion of the leitmotifs that are part and parcel of what we recognize in John Williams's structuring of characters and themes in all of the Star Wars movies, and there are 7, 8 of them now. Have I lost count? All right.
Star Wars films as of a month.
Yeah. Well, John Williams himself has contributed to 8 scores.
Correct.
I believe that Rogue One was another composer, and the funny thing is that these leitmotifs become distinct signals that give us, the viewer, immediate emotional place with where we are in the story. And that's amazing that you said that people are just listening to Howard's music in the background while they read the book itself. I appreciate that. And I honestly admit I've done that myself. When we play certain tabletop games, we have friends over for game night. If we're playing some kind of epic campaign in a fantasy world, whether it's Dungeons and Dragons or if we're playing something else, we'll have Howard's music as background during our 4-5 hour, campaigns. We do this all the time, and I guess that's not surprising, is it? Hashtag nerd.
It was his interpretation of both the Tolkien's writing and of Peter Jackson's filmmaking. So it works. It sort of bridges that gap in a sense. Not that there's a gap to be bridged, but you know what I mean. It addresses both in equal measure with equal artistry, and I think that's beautiful.
It is the leitmotif of The Ring itself. It is one of the single most recognizable things in the world, and you have told some amazing stories about how Mr. Shore can take a leitmotif which is related to, Sauron or Mordor, and when he constructs other variations of it, he'll stay within a range or within a variance. Tell me more. I love you. You do it better than I do, Doug.
Well, I mean, the interrelationships between these themes is as deep as the interrelationship is between the elements of Tolkien's story. But you can, he uses various harmonic languages to depict where you are in the history of the story. If something's ancient, it has a little bit more of a chromatic sense to it. If it's more modern, it has a more modal sense to it, et cetera, et cetera. One of the easier connections people can figure out, if you take the notes of the Ring theme, da, 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 if you're to play those pitches simultaneously, you have the chord that represents the ring rates, which is basically, I'll do it in a simple key, do B, C, A, E. If you play those notes at the same time, that's the chord that you always hear for the da, 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 for the ring rates. I'm sure everyone's enjoying my glorious singing, but you get the idea.
I do. I totally get it.
So it's those type of under the hood details that the ear does pick up on, but then you can intellectualize them to a certain degree as well and understand why these things make sense in this musical world.
Here's a very big thank you for that, and I'm going to get right to one of our first questions on our hotline. This is greetings from Denmark, Cliff and Doug. It's so cool to have Doug himself on the show. Jan is saying, not completely related to music, but I was wondering if Doug has any insight into why the Thranduil and Gandalf scene about the white gems belonging to his wife, his dead wife, are they called the White Gems of Los Galen? Is that what those? They have a proper name, don't they?
They do.
If I'm remembering correctly. And she's like, and she asks, it says, if you have any insight as to why that scene was cut from Battle of the Five Armies, even on the extended version of the film, did Howard Shore ever score that scene? Thank you so much. That's the question.
Of course. I don't believe that scene was scored. Most of what was scored you do see in the extended version of that film. Most of those things end up just being cut for pacing or things like that. I don't know that there's anything to it beyond that. Yeah.
And here's a question from Jen. Jen Bourgeois says, I'd like to know if Doug has any favorite scores on the LOTR or Hobbit soundtracks. Yeah, please. Let's figure out what your tastes are, Doug. Tell us what your favorite bits are. Out of these 6 films, give us your favorite bits. Give us your tasty bits.
Yes. As with so many things, it depends on mood. This time of year, that Shire theme starts to sound pretty good because everybody wants all things good and green, and when I look out the window, it's just snow. So that one. That bit of yes, exactly right. Exactly.
A bit of green hope in the distance.
Exactly, yeah, in the far distance at this point of the year. If I'm feeling a bit more expressive and outward, the destruction of the ring is always one of the great bits of writing that I think Howard provided for those scores because it's so cathartic and so emotive. It takes so many elements from 11 hours of scoring at that point, if you look at the extended editions, and combines and develops them and creates, it pushes into a new world. As I said, Howard always kind of scored the eras of Middle Earth at that point, he starts sweeping all of his old themes away and entering into the fourth age of Middle Earth with new themes for many of the elements you've seen before.
Wow. Yeah.
So it's a real sort of gateway section of the score, and it's just glorious choral writing on top of that. So it's hard to beat it.
It is. Oh yeah, it's really hard to beat that. That's amazing stuff. I am terribly fond of the moment when is the score is it proper to refer to the leitmotif of the ring, or is it Isildur's motif? Is it the ring motif? What's it actually properly called?
The one that we were discussing before?
Yeah, the one that's over the opening title of every film. The
history of the ring. The ring has several different themes, but that is the history of the ring.
Okay, the history of the ring. When the history of the ring is played and you hear it written very small with like an isolated little string instrument floating somewhere in the background, it's beautiful. It's touching in a strange way. But my favorite engineering of that motif is when you see the Argonath. And you get this very large, Western orchestra, big sweep of that motif. And it's written as big of a fanfare as you can get. And there's this kind of swooping angle of the camera across the faces of the ancient kings who were themselves the last remaining of the Numenorians themselves. And you start to feel something of this old energy of Atlantis, which is, of course, Numenor in this context. In Tolkien's world, that's where we're at. And there's a moment where Howard actually takes his flexibility and really puts his unique stamp on it and makes that theme as big and historical and sweeping as the little boats sweep underneath the giant feet, which is just an impression of how huge and weighty that history is behind these little characters that are underneath all that history right there in that moment. You know what I mean? It's so awesome.
The first version of that scene either. The original version of that theme had the Gondor theme being played.
Oh, really?
We've included that. The CD that comes with the music of the Lord of the Rings book. We've included that piece in there, so you can hear. I think we did. we should have. I think we did. You can hear that scene. Originally, the Gondor theme appeared much more in Fellowship. The prologue had a good bit of the Gondor theme when you see the men marching, and the Argonath sequence had the Gondor theme in there, quite large as well. Instead, it was decided just to use a little bit for the Council of Elrond and Boromir's speech. There's a bit of Gondor in there, but they decided mostly to hold that theme so that it could really blossom in the third score. There's a little bit in the long version of the second score as well, but really it makes its main appearance in the third score. But that was sort of an idea that developed over the course of the production.
That's so intriguing. I never knew that. You've just dropped a secret that was not really, the Argonath scene was originally going to be a huge blast of the Gondor theme. Right. I never noticed it until I saw the extended edition of Two Towers where there's that big old Boromir flashback. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, yeah, okay, that's the new theme. I guess we're going to be hearing more of that in the third film, is literally what I thought to myself, in my head. But,
right. There are a few little bits of that in Fellowship as well. Even in the final version of it.
I love that. I love that. The history of the ring is probably really one of my favorite things, because even when Bilbo picks up that damn thing on the ground, you'll hear that. You'll hear the history of the ring theme, and everybody in the audience, even the ones who are grumbling and complaining about the Hobbit films, they don't. At that moment, they stop and they're just like wow, what's that? That very recognizable bit.
There's a gorgeous version of it too when he first finds the ring in Gollum's cave. There's a sort of a major mode variation of it, which is very unusual. But it's incredible. It's amazing that Howard was still finding ways of developing these materials so many years after first writing them.
Yeah, indeed. Going back to the hotline, because we've got a couple of texts. This one is hard to read because it was one block of text that got separated into 5 chunks. And that's what happens when iPhone users receive messages from Samsung users. We get the text messages broken up into like a paper shredder, sort of. So it says, Doug, I was wondering if you can provide any updates on either the complete recordings, music of the Hobbit films book, or The Hobbit. I think I read that wrong, but I think you got the question, Doug.
I think I know what they mean. So there's three parts here, and I've heard these questions quite often. Number one, I know that the complete recordings, the CD box sets of the Lord of the Rings films are they're very hard to get right now. I think they're going for some outrageous amount on Amazon, where people are selling used sets for thousands and thousands of dollars. I don't know the current state.
Before we go further, I'm sorry to interrupt, but is that because Warner Brothers Water Tower Music only printed a small amount? Does that mean they're not going to do another pressing of that?
Well, that I don't know. That I can somewhat address, but without a final answer. A couple of years ago, we did go back and do a little bit more work with the plan of having another pressing. Now, again, I'm just doing the line of notes ends of these. I'm not really the producer or anything like that. But we did go back and work on them again in 15, I think. In like the late winter, early spring of 15, we did some work on them. The thought being that we would get some more out the door and they'd be back on the market. For whatever reason, that didn't come to pass, but that work was done, and I assume at some point it will see the light of day. So my guess is, only based on my own experience, that yes, they will be back on the marketplace at some point, but I don't know exactly when. As far as complete recordings or box sets for the Hobbit films, there hasn't been any discussion on those yet. It's something that I would love to see as well. I know when we originally did those albums this time, they did much more complete versions of the albums with the initial release. The reason that we did complete recordings for Lord of the Rings is because the first commercial albums were essentially suites with the standard soundtrack album type of thing, where it was one disc and I forget the length, 60, 70, 80 minutes, whatever it happened to be. And there was so much music left to release that it justified going back and doing these multi-disc sets. For The Hobbit, the majority of the music came out in the first pass, but not all of it, as the fans have rightly noticed. And there's still a few little bits and odds and ends of things from Lord of the Rings that people are trying to get as well. So I hope that they come back at some point and do the Hobbit scores in long, complete editions. I would absolutely be thrilled as a fan myself to have that all in a nice form. As for the music of the Hobbit films book, I'm looking at it right now over here, but no one else is. It is something that I've done. There's no specific timeline or release date or anything like that, but it is, something that was officially put together at the time that I was working on the liner notes, actually. So as we were working on those albums, I would finish up each album around October of the year they were going to be released, and then kind of come home and start compiling things back into book form. So by the time we got through the third Hobbit film, I was able to spend the next 4 or 5 months, something like that, taking all that material that I've been collecting and working on and putting it into book form. So it is something that exists in a rough form. It needs to be laid out and all that sort of thing. And I hope it will happen soon. That's all I really can say for sure.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. That's more of an answer than I expected or deserved. That's awesome. But I do understand that this is from the completist, the quadrant of fans who are out there who really would like to be completists and have, like myself, a nice complete collection of all of that music. And I understand that I see where you are in that process, and thank you for answering that question.
Sure. And again, most of these are things that are beyond my control anyway. I do my bit of it. It's like anybody that works on these creative things. There are other people that ultimately pull the strings, but we do our bit and hope that the powers that be push them along while we're not looking. So.
And I hope they pull the trigger on that, buddy. I hope they do. It should be out to the world. And I love this. I mean, the idea of getting every scrap of music and even finding the ones that were recorded and not used, it's funny that there's this level of, really, like I said at the top of the show, going down the rabbit hole to talk about Howard's music, we end up going there. There's an appetite for getting more of what Howard made in relation to this world. And do you think that speaks to the passion that ringers have and their attachment to these stories? It's really beautiful and unique that many readers and lovers of Tolkien's books and people who love Peter's films really feel so personally involved. And I covered a lot of that when I did my documentary, Ringers, Lord of the Fans. But don't you find that too?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of being just the evergreen quality of the work and the dedication and passion and admirable focus of the fans. I think it's a wonderful thing.
I agree. I agree. One of the things that I most appreciated in my career working with the One Ring was getting to host that Fellowship of the Ring Oscar party way back in Los Angeles. Back in the day. And I actually got to hold Howard Shore's Oscar that night that he got for Fellowship. And you've been like deep in the trenches, like really right there, tooth and nail with Howard, you know, and I had that lucky wisp of a moment. And this is my Wii controller, but we'll pretend my Wii controller is an Oscar. And he, you know, I'm like, I said, Mr. Shore, you really wouldn't mind terribly if and I pointed at it, and he had it resting on the pool table. Nobody was shooting pool, but we were at the Hollywood Athletic Club, of course, and it's a famous place, a famously haunted building in Hollywood. And that upper level where we were at, John Wayne would famously be playing pool with his friends back in the 50s, and sometimes he would startle people down on the sidewalk below by dropping billiard balls to smack and crack on the sidewalk right next to them just to freak them out. It was something that John Wayne was. So I'm there in that same room with the ghost of, you know, all these old 1920s actors, and there's Howard Shore's Oscar. And I said, Mr. Shore, you don't mind if I could hold your Oscar? And he's like, go right ahead. And he's like, I'd be glad that someone else should try to hold it, not me. Because he says, wait, go ahead. You'll see. And I went over and I tried to pick it up, and I could almost barely pick it up. Yeah. Is this a science experiment at the planetarium where they're saying this is your gravity on Jupiter, and you try to pick up something and you can't because it's too heavy? I'm like, what is this? And it was really the heaviest thing in the world. Oscars are heavy. And then I turned to him, and I actually had a conversation with him about my favorite classical composer, Rimsky-Korsakov. And we talked about the use of instruments and color and in layman's terms, and I don't know anywhere near as much technically as you know, good sir, but I managed to hold up quite a conversation with Mr. Howard Shore for like 5 minutes, and it was the best 5 minutes of the party. For me, the best night of my life.
Well, and I have to say, for all the wonderful things that this has led to in my life, you know, it's satisfied musical desires and the ability to do things like this, which are hugely fun. It's allowed me to travel the world, but I don't know that anything has brought me the great enduring joy of being able to count Howard as one of my friends. He's just a wonderfully kind soul, and been a great guide through this whole thing. So, you know, the other stuff is all kind of frosting compared to that.
Love it. Okay, regaling in the past. I'm sorry to do that, but thank you. Back to the hotline. Brennan Marr sends a message saying, I'm very glad that Howard Shore did The Lord of the Rings. As much as I love John Williams, his style may not have fit, meaning Mr. Williams may not have fit within this, you know, type of world, this world where we were set. Beautifully photographed by the late Andrew Lesney. And I do appreciate that. We recognize John Williams' music instantly, even when we hear it in a dinosaur park versus when we hear it on a spaceship. You know, when John Williams wants to go big and playful with that type of stuff, it's still very recognizably his work, you know?
Quite right, yeah.
It's true. So, and here's another one. Can we nail down exactly what Doug's job title is? This is hilarious. It says, what does he do? And there's lots of letter O's, do, in a long. Okay, so what's that, Doug? You tell me.
What's my job? I've been trying for about 15 years to figure it out myself, so I don't know that I'm going to have
it. Well, you're a music historian and a journalist, a music journalist, and a music author. And I think your authorship is without question, quite honestly, having been up close and personal with you, sir, and having seen you in front of a keyboard yourself, being able to explain and musically illustrate to the people in the room your points. I mean, have you decided whether or not you're going to do a TED Talk yet, Doug?
Hey, if I'm invited to do a TED Talk, I absolutely will.
Should.
They know where
to find you, right?
Yeah. Go to Twitter. Go to Doug Adams Music.
Another message from our friend Jan in Denmark. Can Doug Adams provide any insight in general into how much was cut from the movies, meaning how much of the music was cut from the movies, especially the Hobbit films, and if he believes we'll ever get the Super Unicorn edition, which we've discussed on previous episodes of Torn Tuesday, with more deleted scenes and content. Thank you once again for the live stream. Best regards, Jan from Denmark. Thank you. She's lovely. Excellent. What do you think? I should say
music was cut. Well, most of the music that we haven't heard would be earlier drafts of things that we have heard. There were certainly a number of scenes, I guess I'm thinking of the first Hobbit film, where things were rewritten several times. The Radagast stuff was written a number of times. Trying to think of anything rewritten quite as many times as that. But there's versions of things that people haven't heard, but in terms of like entire sequences, the young Aragorn thing or things like that. No, there's not existing music for any of those that hasn't escaped to the general public or anything like that. I'm not even sure I can think of too much by way of entire scenes that were scored that maybe the music came up but the scene never did. I think most of it matches up fairly well. There's a few bits here and there, of course. But for the most part,
in these terms, because Christopher Tolkien himself had managed to let us as fans get access to many, many scraps of Tolkien's work that were there but discarded and never really published. So I think we're in that mindset that we're still expecting scraps of something that's been completed a long time ago, right?
Right. Yes, I mean, and when we did the Lord of the Rings book, we included the CD of bits of music that, again, mostly earlier drafts, sometimes songs that were used, things like that. Yes, and then for the Hobbits, sure, of course. So it would be nice to do that again with the Hobbit at some point and have some of these pieces of music that were earlier drafts or rough ideas or things like that and get them out into the world. So,
hey guys, this is Justin. Just chiming in here because we're getting a ton of very specific questions. I thought we could rapid fire some responses of very specific musical questions from the chat room. You ready, Doug?
Yes, Justin.
Yeah. Sure.
Bring them.
All right.
Bring those questions, Justin.
Wondering what went into the decision to use the Ringwraith theme for the scene when Thorin charged Azog at the end of Unexpected Journey.
Well, that was another one. As people who have the album know, that's not the original version of that theme. So that was a filmmaker request to make it a bit darker. There's a text that goes with that I hope we can release if we get to do the book at some point, that refers a little bit more to what's happening in that scene. It's not the text that they would have used for the Ringwraiths. So that was one of those things that more was a request from the filmmakers than anything else.
There's another question. We've talked, not on this episode previously, about a mythical unicorn edition of The Lord of the Rings featuring scenes that were even cut from extended edition. We've talked to some of the behind the scenes people saying there's more documentaries to be had. Do you know if there's how much score has been recorded that wasn't used?
Like I said, not very much in terms of scenes that people haven't seen. The score that has been recorded basically pertains to the cuts of the film that people have seen, but the music people haven't heard would be like earlier drafts of things. The first pass at the Argonaut that we were discussing earlier hadn't been heard until we put that out a few years ago. So it's things like that where it's an earlier version with maybe a different thematic approach to something.
That was genuinely an eyebrow raiser for me. I was really glad to learn that detail, Doug.
Very cool.
Yes.
The original draft is gorgeous too. I think you'll like it when you check it out.
Oh yeah, awesome. That's awesome.
Another question from the chat room: Have you played or listened to any of the music from the video games that have recently come out? Shadow of Mordor.
I'm actually not a huge gamer, to be completely honest. I'm vaguely familiar with some of them. I think I checked out some of the samples at one point, but my making a living in music keeps one quite busy, so I don't really get a lot of time to sit in front of the PlayStation as much as I'd like to. Or is that on PlayStation? I don't know. Whatever system it's on. Now, I don't know.
Another question. What do you think of... there's so much pop music, rock and roll, especially, Scandinavian metal, all the way to David Arkenstone, kind of folk song. Why do do you think none of the existing music was used for the films?
Using existing music in film is a tricky thing because you either have to slice up the music or you have to cut the film around the music. You'll notice there are some directors who do that, like Martin Scorsese does that quite often, although he also works with Howard Shore quite often. But they usually, in those cases, try to find something that matches. Like it'll oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes go into a sort of montage scene or something like that, where the music can play over a series of scenes of something happening. And I think that wasn't the type of filmmaking they were going for in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings and Hobbit films. It was more of a classical type of filmmaking. Much in the same way that. The comparison we always make is the Star Wars films. Everybody knows the music from those, and they don't suddenly drop in a pop tune because they were going for that older, more mythological approach. So I think that was part of the reason. And certainly pop and rock music has had a wonderful history with Tolkien, everything from Led Zeppelin to the Beatles and all this sort of stuff. I know there's a ton of things happening in northeastern areas now where they're very focused on that. But I think it just wasn't quite what they were going for in terms of the tone of these pictures.
Another question from the chat room. Does the Two Towers have the most amount of unique themes in it?
The largest number of unique themes in it.
Ooh.
I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I bet that's probably true. It's quite possibly true. There's a lot of material introduced in Fellowship that isn't like the big theme stuff. There's a lot of little interstitial pieces that are motifs that sort of bind things together that are introduced in there. But in terms of major new themes, Two Towers, you have the Rohirrim, you have Treebeard, you have what are other major new themes? Gollum gets 2 themes. So yeah, that might be a fair statement. That might be. I'd have to sit and actually crunch the numbers on that. But.
Indeed. Good. Now, I just remembered out of the back of my head, I was thinking, is there another theme that I was very, very fond of? And I have to admit that nobody gets to mention this very much, and I bet you hardly ever hear people talking about it. But there's this unusual quality of the music when Merry and Pippin are in Fangorn, and we hear Treebeard's theme, which I'm very fond of, and the unusual sound that Howard gets out of these instruments when Treebeard scenes are active in the Two Towers, but also when we're in Mirkwood in Desolation of Smaug, there's so many weird and unusual things going on with the visuals, and there's Howard trying to make us feel even more hallucinogenic with some of his choices. I have to admit, every time we go into the deep, dark forest, Howard Shore delivers unexpected surprises with his music. I don't know if anyone's ever bothered to point that out, but it is really kind of cool when you stop to think about it.
He lives in a forest, so I'm sure he has a lot of first-hand experience with that sort of thing.
Awesome. Yeah.
Stuff was all bass marimba and log drums, which are literally hollowed-out logs. It's sort of an instrument of African origin, and creates these deep, resonant, wooden sort of echoing tones within the orchestra, and then you double that with the low basses and contrabassoons and things like that, and you get this very wooden, deep, profound sound in the orchestra.
I love it. I love that stuff. That's so good. Justin, do we have more questions from the live chat?
You may have lost it.
I actually have, this is just one from me. I've always wanted to know, what your thoughts are that Howard Shore did not conduct the last 2 Hobbit sequels, and do you think the music suffered because of it, and do you think there's value to a composer actually doing the conducting and able to adjust his work on the fly in front of an orchestra?
It's a tricky thing. So that was largely dictated by the schedule of those films. And it was funny because I was with him in New York while those recording sessions were going on. So we would, be working late into the night, and he'd have to go off and write some more music. And then the next day we'd have some delivery of some music from Conrad Pope and the team in New Zealand. But what was happening is the film was still being edited. Howard was still composing, but the music had to begin being recorded. And with everything moving down to New Zealand, it just was too long of sort of a turnaround to sort of do the composing and then the conducting and everything else. And it just became clearly the schedule worked better with two teams sort of working simultaneously in that sense.
On opposite sides of the planet, let us
literally
remind the audience.
Exactly. That sort of thing is not completely uncommon in film. And in fact, it happens more in film than people may realize, where composers will have someone else conduct part or all of a score just to make things sort of work that way. Even the last two Star Wars scores are partially not conducted by John Williams. A wonderful musician by the name of William Ross came in and conducted some pieces of those. Gustavo Dudamel from the Los Angeles Philharmonic conducted a bit from Star Wars 7.
And that's our boy, Dudamel. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah,
here in LA. Yeah,
that's right. Some composers, such as Danny Elfman, never conducts his own work. He's not really comfortable as a conductor. He prefers to spend his time in the recording booth. Michael Giacchino, who's a very popular composer these days, largely does the same thing, where he'll have a conductor at the session while he sits in the booth and likes to hear what the mix is, since he thinks ultimately that's what goes out to audiences. Musicians have as many opinions as there are musicians on that sort of thing. Some feel that the only authentic performance is the one conducted by the composer, but of course you have, when's the last time anyone's heard Beethoven conduct, right? So there are, many approaches to this. What does one really feel is the best approach? It's the arts. It depends on who you ask.
There's a question from...
Intriguing. I'm sorry, Justin. Further to this point, I find it interesting to consider John Ottman, who is an acquaintance of mine. His job is way beyond just scoring the music and composing it. He's also the bloody film editor. And so he's putting on another series of job responsibilities that it kind of bends the mind a little bit. But then, Doug, real quick, let me inject this question. Do you think it might be advantageous, certainly, for someone like John Ottman to know how he wants to edit his film with his own score? It kind of cuts out extra middlemen and makes it more of a streamlined effort in a way, right?
Well, it certainly means there's no surprises in the edit room. You come in and realize that you have 5 minutes more to a scene that you never wrote any music for, because he knows exactly what he's getting.
Exactly.
I think the editor and the composer are the two that really need to be the most in sync on these productions sometimes, because it does become just a question of numbers at a certain point. You have to write how many measures of music to cover how many frames of film, and gotta have a good idea of what you're getting into. So there's certainly an advantage to having that same person wearing both hats.
I do admire John Ottman's work for that in the X-Men universe. I do appreciate that guy. He's cool.
Yeah. Speaking of other universes, there's been a lot of talk that the Marvel universe, cinematic universe, and even the Justice League universe, which is there's 3 or 4 films now, are so not. There's nothing memorable about the music. In fact, I don't think I could whistle a tune that has anything to do with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And none of
the only one I know for sure, I recognize Wonder Woman's motif immediately with those grinding guitars, and that that's not an expected motif you'd ever expect associated with her, but I know it in my head.
So what's
electric cello? The modern approach to a lot of these pieces, and there are themes. I shall notice in the the latest Avengers trailer, they make a big use of Alan Silvestri's theme that he wrote for the first Avengers film. So they do sort of lean into some of these themes sometimes. But there's sort of a I don't know, maybe a Marvel sound would be the easiest way to put it, where the writing tends to have all the motion of the orchestra is in the accompaniment lines, and the melodies themselves tend to be very broad, slow rhythms that maybe don't have that same earworm quality as something where the rhythm is more varied and maybe even more speech pattern like. So a lot of the Marvel themes have that jigga 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 going on under the melody, where the melody will just be almost a chorale like writing, very whole notes and half notes, and very slow moving, very rhythmically blocky. And I think it makes them a little bit harder to refer back to quickly. They've made more of an effort in their most recent films to get something more high profile musically. Doctor Strange had a more traditional score, again by Michael Giacchino. Ant-Man had a nice score.
And we know Michael Giacchino from also doing the J.J. Abrams reboot Star Trek scores as well, right?
Right. Yes, exactly. And a number of Pixar films. I think he has Incredibles 2 coming up. The Planet of the Apes, the last two of those.
That's right. And Rogue One, actually.
And Rogue One as well. Exactly right.
Yeah, that's right.
So now, as far as the DC universe, they actually tried referring back to some of those classic themes in the last one. They brought in Danny Elfman to do it, who referred perhaps more indirectly than we imagined, but a bit to his 1989 Batman theme and to John Williams' 1970, whatever it was, Superman theme. So he kind of worked those into his score a little bit to sort of remind people of that old manner of thematic writing.
Why do you think there's
a lot of contention on Twitter? I'm sorry to interrupt, Justin, but what Mr. Elfman bringing in his old motifs like that did cause a lot of back and forth and really angry commentary, I remember, on Twitter. Especially
I didn't like it because I thought it was old-fashioned, which kind of made me feel old. But
why do you think there's an aversion to not using the old stuff?
Honestly, what I think part of it is it's because of the way things are edited these days. Films are edited because of digital editing much later into production, often bleeding into post-production. And this type of thematic writing is not quite as punchy in terms of hitting as many things on screen, and it's easier to edit, to sort of drop 2 beats here and shift everything over, and it matches into the film again. So the writing has become more atmospheric and less balletic. You're not hitting specific. Batman punches somebody. You don't always get a pow on the punch. You just sort of have a piece that drifts through the scene and sets a bit of atmosphere and color. And I think it's because part of it's just an aesthetic. I think people have come to consider that a more modern sound. And part of it is because these films are edited so late into the game that you can't really try to write that type of score that hits individual beats because, again, the edit keeps moving and you can't really sync things up as effectively or as efficiently as we could. When people used to cut on actual film back in the 70s and 80s, they had to lock that cut. And once that cut was locked, it was locked. You couldn't do anything. You'd have to physically go in and take frames out or put frames in to change it. So the composer had a decent sense of what they were working with. A lot of these modern films, people are writing to storyboards because the effects aren't coming in until 2 days before it's released, And with digital distribution, you don't even need all that time.
Indeed. So that makes the composer's job a bit weirder, in how the process goes down the tubes or through the flow chart, so to speak.
I always think of composition as this very pure thing that somehow we've corrupted it in this modern sense where it has to fit in with the technicalities of film editing and frames and digital effects and things like that. But it's always been a matter of that. Even Wagner one time had to rewrite a bit of one of his operas to accommodate a large piece of scenery that couldn't get across the stage quickly enough. This is back in the 1800s. So these aren't entirely modern inconveniences. There's plenty of history for this in classical music for centuries preceding this. It's the old dictum of everything always being better in the past, and certainly musicians are quite guilty of that, maybe more so than anyone else, and I'm speaking for myself here, not throwing a bunch of musicians under the bus, but we do always like to say the old ways are the good ways, and why can't we get back to that? And there's always been circumstances beyond our control as musicians. Is part of the name of the game. You go back to Beethoven wrote string quartets for families that would specifically request, we're paying for this, we want it to be of this manner, and so on and so forth. And yes, he would rant and rage against it, the same as composers often do with filmmakers. But somebody's always paid for these things, and somebody's always had a few ideas and a few demands, and, my cousin's aunt's sister's brother's girlfriend wants a piece that's pretty. So you have to go back and change 7 bars because they weren't pretty enough or whatever. There's always something. It's just how music works. Somebody always pays for it, and somebody always executes it. They may
That's brilliant. That sometimes there's just an emperor who walks in and says, "There's too many notes."
Quite right. Yeah.
Here and there, and it'll be perfect.
Yeah.
Because, as you know, there's only so many notes the human ear can hear in one evening. So you know what I'm doing, Doug.
That's how it is, of course. Yeah.
Yes, I'm totally the ultimate. I love that movie. That if anybody asks me, and this might give away some of my personal tastes more than I want. But when someone asks, what's your favorite film? Everybody always in the room assumes that I'm the guy who's going to say, oh, Lord of the Rings movies. Oh, Clifford, yeah, he loves Lord of the Rings. That's his thing. He's obsessed with Lord of the Rings. And I will quietly raise my hand in the corner and say, Amadeus is my favorite film, honestly.
There you go.
I mean, it's true. It's really, but that's one of the finest examples of the fusion of visuals and music to really take the audience to those levels of the story, and having such rich, fertile music available to emotionally punctuate that particular story. And believe it or not, when I was a little teenager and that movie became my obsession, I went to the public library and started checking out vinyl records of old Salieri pieces because I wanted to learn more about Salieri, believe it or not. And connecting it back to Lord of the Rings, ultimately, Sir Ian McKellen won the Tony Award for playing who? Salieri. Thank you. Bringing it back to Lord of the Rings. Thank you.
And they've begun doing Amadeus live in concert, much in the manner that they've done Lord of the Rings live in concert, where you have the film projected and the orchestra on the stage doing the music. So they've sort of followed suit. Lord of the Rings got there first in this case, but, I mean, not that the Mozart wasn't done on stage prior to the film, but you know what I mean.
Okay, now it's time in our broadcast, as we enter the third act, to talk about the big, 800-pound gorilla in the room. Everybody knows that Jeff Bezos and Amazon has thrown down $250 million to get the license with the agreement of the Tolkien estate, which is somewhat shocking, to make these new prequel series for Amazon. Thank you, Amazon, for throwing down your faith and your belief in Tolkien's legendarium. But now the ultimate question, which is burning the internet up, is how much of this new production, imagining that they're going to start digging out anthology stories from the appendices, including many hundreds, even thousands of years before the events of the War of the Ring. Do you, Doug, think that it's likely, or do you think it's appropriate? These are two different questions. Is it likely and is it appropriate for these producers to creatively use music that Howard and obvious leitmotifs that Howard did as they continue their strange journey to making a new Tolkien adaptation? What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, this is solely my opinion. I would be first curious to see whether or not they're trying to make it all fit in with the existing cinematic universe or cinematic interpretation of all this. If they're trying to do their own thing, perhaps it makes sense for them to establish what the sound of that thing is. It's always a tricky thing trying to bring music back in a different guise. It can be done, sure. John Ottman has done it when they tried to reboot Superman with the Bryan Singer picture a few years ago, a number of years ago now. They maintained most of John Williams' theme, and I think a couple of his, like the love theme, I think was in there as well. And sometimes it works in a new context, sometimes it doesn't. If they're, as I'm personally hoping that they do, if they're trying to make it fit in with everything, in that case, I would think that the music would be an essential part of it. Because now, again, look who you're asking, of course. But to me, that music is an absolutely essential and crucial part of the experience of taking Tolkien to the big screen right now. So if they want to make something that fits in, I think that's an indispensable part of it. And I would hope that some of this very large budget would be dedicated toward making that happen in a artistically satisfying manner.
You better believe it.
They will.
Well, okay. If Ian McKellen has already told people, even jokingly, if Ian McKellen has said, I would be totally willing to come back and do some more Gandalf and reprise that role, do you think we should put the question to Howard and say, Howard, would you like to come back to Middle-earth again?
I think it's a worthwhile question, absolutely. He did a concert work of his premiered in Canada earlier this year, and someone asked him if he would ever write any music again for anything Tolkien-based. And he kind of gave a two-sided answer, saying on one side he feels that he's said all he can say in the Tolkien world, but on the other hand he feels he should never say never. He doesn't want to ever close the door. And I do remember when he was finishing Return of the King, which is one of the time, this was during Lord of the Rings, a time during which I was sort of around him the most. mean, that probably picked up during The Hobbit a bit, but during Lord of the Rings, that was a time that I was really seeing the most of it. And he said, like, he felt that they had to absolutely pull the score away from him at the end, because had they not told him, look, there's no more story, there's no more film, you can't keep doing this, he would have just kept writing forever. He felt so edified and gratified and content writing this music in this world that he may never have stopped. He said it was probably good at the end that somebody said, you got to quit doing this. You got to come up for air for a minute here.
Wow, that's awesome. Wow.
That makes me feel like perhaps there are reserves that he would be, I'm certain he could do it. I think it would be a question of whether or not he would find it artistically satisfying is there another angle to approach us all from that he would enjoy. I'm sure he could come up with something. And again, to me, if it's part of that world, if it's supposed to feel like it fits in with the Ian McKellen Gandalf and all that, you need that music back, don't you? I don't know. To my ears, that's who knows? Maybe they'll find someone brilliant to put a new spin on it, but that's where I come from.
Intriguing. It's all intriguing, especially we have many question marks over this conversation as we go forward. Fan speculation, as it is wont to do, is going to go like wildfire through a dry prairie, to quote Steinbeck. So we're gonna get some questions. We're gonna get even less answers, the way that Star Wars fans are feeling right now, because they've had 2 years of questions and got very little answers. Sorry, I'm kind of joking. I really appreciate the idea that Howard might want to come back, but if I were an actor working as, going forward, this is exciting. I'm going to go and audition for this new Lord of the Rings series. It would be an exciting point in anyone's career. But who would ever want to walk into Ian McKellen's shoes? Same thing. What composer would ever want to come in and be like, oh, well, here I am in Middle Earth, F me. What's going to happen? What am I going to do? I'm in Howard Shore's immense shadow. And any composer would think that. They're in the shadow of the work that's been done before, and that's going to require a breakthrough. And that is a lot more pressure on an artist, a musician who's trying to write, to feel like they have to be constantly compared. Even Peter Jackson, when making The Hobbit, knew that he was in his own shadow and was constantly going to be compared to his previous 3 films. And that, for better or worse, ended up being the case. The Hobbit was constantly compared to its predecessor. And I've kind of held in a twisted time travel kind of logic that if The Hobbit actually came out first, we would have fallen in love with that and would have embraced it. And the fans wouldn't have been so bitchy about it. And we would have been happy with what we got. And then we would have been thrilled with the Lord of the Rings that came later. We would have been over the moon with all that stuff. But, fans are fans, How do you, Doug, would you like to see the producers of the Amazon series recreate designs, armor, architecture, and distinct, looks of the cultures of men and elves and dwarves, the way that Weta did? Would you like to see them stay within the world that Weta created and that Howard created? Or would you personally, I'm sitting on the fence myself. I'm thinking it might be nice to get a whole fresh take on all of this. And this is the feeling I had tentatively when Del Toro was going to be our director. I knew that his Hobbit was not going to be a match in lockstep with Peter Jackson's previous films. And I was kind of feeling the fresh air blowing through the window, thinking, wow, this might be interesting to have a whole fresh take on this world of Middle-earth. We never got that, obviously. And Peter went back to doing very, very strict alignment with his original films, as we know. So what do you think, Doug, as a fan?
As a fan, I think I would like to see something that is connected but has its own specific energy to it. I don't know that I want to see something that's a reboot. I feel that there's so much territory within Tolkien's wide-reaching writing that you can find something that connects to the world but has its own specific energy to it. I don't want to feel like they have tossed everything existing out the window. I would like to see, the same Gandalf and the same Elrond should he happen to pop up, or things like that. I'd like to hear that the themes that I associate with these characters have their existence again. again, you know, it's the comparison that we keep making here, but everyone's found it very satisfying to see. I don't know, the response has been varied on the latest Star Wars, but it's nice to see Han come back. It's nice to see Luke come back and be the actor we recognize and hear the theme that we recognize. And it's nice to revisit some of these things at a different point in our own lives and see them develop as artistic entities. You know, should we hear the theme to Gondor in something set between the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings? I would be fascinated to see what that would do to the theme. I would be absolutely over the moon to hear Howard say, well, now the theme is going to head off this direction because I feel that there's this sort of an energy here, or what have you. As a fan, I would find that immensely satisfying. You know, it would be nice to see that in a different place and to feel that resonate with me in a different place in my own life. So I think that could be quite cool.
Do you think
I agree.
If they started using Howard Shore's original score for the TV series, that it sets an unfair bar and expectation from the audience? If you know, the first scene coming in and it's all these familiar themes, and you know, this is a television series, so the production's going to look different. It's going to feel different. There's going to be different actors. Do you think it's unfair to the rest of production to reuse some of these themes because the first thing we hear will set our expectations?
Well, that's the thing. If they end up recasting it and doing a completely different take on it, where it isn't meant to feel like it fits into the existing filmic universe or whatever, then it probably makes sense to have a different approach to it. Like, I don't think you would want to hear the Gondor theme that we associate with these films used in somebody else's, you know, cinematic world that they've created, the narrative world. I think it needs to stake its own claim if that's the case. If it's meant to be within that world and we'll eventually be able to watch all these things in a row and have this massive story told, then I think it would be okay to include those themes as part of that world, part of that texture.
Hey, we got another question from the YouTube chat. Great question, actually. For someone that wants to eventually get into film and television scoring, you know, and is supporting their friends and their YouTube or video game efforts now on an independent basis, what are some other books besides your own that would be good to read, or, you know, documentaries to watch or something?
That help one learn about the art of film scoring. Gosh, that was part of the reason that I wrote that book, was because nobody had done a thing like that, you know. And I would be back as a university student trying to research these things. There was never anything out there. There are books that are sort of broader. There's one that they've used for many, many years. I don't know if they still do, out at the Berklee College of Music in Boston, called On the Track. That is sort of a how-to guide of some of the technicalities of scoring. I know they've released a series of sort of shorter books on individual scores, but I'm not hugely familiar with them to know of the quality. I've got a couple more that I hope to have out soon. The Hobbit book is coming. We're doing another one. Actually, this was another one that kind of came through a collaboration with Howard of sort of the history of silent film music and the very first 25 years of film music that we're hoping to have out in another, well, in the somewhat near future. Impossible Silence, we call it. So that maybe that would be good.
Let me inject an idea that it would be so cool, just from my little fan 2 cents, is if they discard everything that was there before and make all this new series something fresh and all original. But the one thing that they keep is that History of the Ring leitmotif. And they play that over the credits. That's the only thing I want. That's the only thing I want to hear. That's it. And I'll be happy as a clam, at least for that one nod, you know, to that. But
why do you think there's not a lot of scholarship for film scoring? It kind of starts with Star Wars and ends with Lord of the Rings, but you know, it's our main storytelling narrative mode of culture now, and there isn't, as you said, there's not a lot of scholarship to research and write.
Well, Doug, that is a call to arms for us, Doug. We should get together and make a documentary series about all these film scorers. Let's make a pitch to Netflix, okay? And we'll do a bunch of episodes about different film scorers, and we'll follow their careers and see. We'll unlock the mechanism that way. Let's do that.
I can give you. I'm plugging myself here tastelessly, but I'll do it anyway.
Good.
There's no tasteful way to do it, so I'll do it. As we were sort of between the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit films, Howard Shore scored a film for Martin Scorsese called Hugo.
I love that movie so much.
Beautiful, beautiful film, yes. It's ostensibly the story of a little boy in a train station, but then sort of on the side tells the story of Georges Méliès, a wonderful early silent filmmaker, and sort of his place in the history of film. So Howard scored that, and I actually I had to record an instrument for that we couldn't find. They wanted a recording of an instrument called an orchestrion, which is a sort of giant calliope type of beast that plays automated music and this sort of thing. And they had a recording that they liked that they wanted to use for a flashback scene that was actually supposed to sync up to a carousel or merry-go-round. And they tracked down the instrument because they couldn't get the license to the recording they liked. They tracked down the instrument in the Chicago area, not too far from where I was. So I got a call from Howard one afternoon asking if I could go produce a recording very quickly of this instrument and they could use it in the film. So after, sitting up all night, a couple of nights trying to figure out how one tracks down all the details for recording this instrument, we got it to work. I actually got a little credit in the film, which is a wonderful, very kind gesture on their part.
Awesome.
But it got us very invested in, well, what is the actual history of film music in this time period? Everyone kind of knows the out-of-tune ragtime piano stuff, but what really was happening? Was there serious work in the effort this early on? And there was, and that turned into this book that we eventually hope to have out in the next few months or in a year or so. Hopefully not that long. So Impossible Silence is that book, and that sort of details the history of it. And in researching that, a lot of what I learned is that so many of these composers took film very, very seriously early on when it was silent. When sound came about, it also coincided with a lot of composers wanting to get out of Europe because the political situation was getting very, very horrifying. So they came over to the States, and in the States were not able to maintain these careers as concert hall operatic composers because there wasn't that sort of structure in place for them to make a living that way. So a lot of them moved to the West Coast and found jobs writing for film. Max Steiner, Korngold, people like this were essentially the concert hall composers, the last wave of big late romantic concert hall composers from Europe moving over to the States. A lot of people treated them as if they were sellouts for making what ended up being a very large amount of money working in this manner. And because of that, academia and the scholars sort of turned up their noses to it.
I see.
It became very difficult for serious research to happen related to film music. And that was a sort of a snobbish attitude that sort of exists until this day, although it's starting to break down. There was a wonderful New Yorker article on John Williams this week. We have the music of Howard Shore and his film music in the concert hall, and wonderful concert halls all around the States and Europe on a very regular basis. And it's beginning to be taken more seriously. You have musicians like myself that grew up, I'm sure probably the first time I ever heard an orchestra was in a film. I probably saw some cartoon as a kid in the theater, and I hear music, I don't know what it is, and it just, that sound, it plants a seed in your ear that grows all your life if you're a musician.
Well, it was that animated short from Warner Brothers, What's Opera, Doc. That was every American child's first introduction to Wagner. It really was.
Oh yeah, all those Wagner quotes everyone knows, from all the Carl Stalling scores to the Bugs Bunny cartoon.
Why
the Wabbit.
Yeah, exactly. So that's, I think, why there's not more writing and research in this area yet, but I think as my generation comes of age and worms our way into academia a little bit more, or into the professional music world, or both, I think you will see more serious consideration of the music that's been written for film, because it really has been, the classical or a part of the classical music of our lives, of our generation. And I think it deserves that serious consideration, the same as the great operas and ballets and symphonies and concerti of the past. I think it's it's an incredibly important entry into that history.
Why do you what do you think it is about Middle Earth's music that has led the wave of books, scholarships, special edition soundtracks, even the like you said, the live the live concerts that basically Lord of the Rings kicked off, and now every major geek film has a tour of local orchestras playing to music. What do you think it is about these films and this music that is leading the charge?
Well, in a crass sense, the fans are dedicated and will pay for it. I mean, it seems very inelegant, but that is true. If the audience shows up, when an orchestra puts the Lord of the Rings on their concert series, we all know that it's a wonderful artistic thing, but it also fills seats. People aren't necessarily coming out to hear a little-known Hindemith symphony or something like that, but they're going to show up for Lord of the Rings. And thankfully, there's enough meat on those bones musically that the orchestras have something that they can really express themselves through. There are people that can think about this music, it can enter the press. It becomes a nice, as the local chorus will begin learning Elvish and things like that. So it becomes a little grassroots movement in each town it goes to. And I think that's the passion of the Lord of the Rings fans, is that they made that viable. And again, that doesn't mean to just say like, well, there's money in it, so we're going to do it. But just it's not a futile expenditure on these orchestras' parts, because it's not cheap to bring these things to town. The rights and the screens and the musicians and the chorus and everything, the logistics of it are quite complicated. It's not an easy show to put on in that sense. People are, when they first proposed doing this, the first orchestras to do this were it was in Switzerland. The wonderful conductor Ludwig Vicky, who still conducts a number of the shows to this day. And everybody looked at him as to say, are you sure you can do that? You're doing all the music. I just do a suite? You're doing all the music with the film? Or can you do that? And Ludwig, powered by enthusiasm, chocolate, and coffee, said, oh yeah, I can do it. It's fine. And he was right. He could do it. He's an absolute, madman and a genius and just a crazy, mad scientist and stuff. And he made it happen. And that's what largely proved to audiences and producers that you could do this sort of thing. That's what the film music concert was sort of born in this form, in a sense. There have been some earlier experiments with it, and I don't want to say experiment in that it went off the rails or anything. They were successful. They'd done E.T. at the Hollywood Bowl before this, but it wasn't the type of thing where it was showing up regularly. It wasn't a recurring thing, and he proved that this can be done night after night with accuracy and artistic legitimacy. So it was very cool.
The legacy of Professor Tolkien looms large over all these proceedings, of course. Let me interject an idea. Doug, don't you think it's fascinating, really, that Christopher Tolkien, the executor of the estate, has decided to retire, and now all of a sudden there's, surprisingly, this consensus of agreement within the family, within the estate, to cooperate and let more adaptations be made from the book? And do you think that signals a sea change in how we might look at the Silmarillion in future years, or how the Tolkien estate might view those possibilities?
Well, my only experiences with the Tolkien estate have been, and these were a number of years ago, so under the old regime, were very, very positive. They were hugely supportive of my work. Like anything, they're not specifically behind it. They don't really say this is a Tolkien estate production, but you make sure that you contact them and you do your due diligence and run anything through them. And they were very supportive and kind, and I have nothing but generous things to say about them. In terms of what doors may now be open, I'm a fan in that regard, waiting like everyone else to see what exactly happens. Would the Silmarillion be possible? Certainly seems like it could be. That's what I thought the Amazon thing would be at first, until I heard more details. I figured that was the fertile ground that they'd finally decided to dig into, but it sounds like it's in a different era, so maybe not. Maybe not.
There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of discussion of Numenor and in the Second Age, and that's all an appendix right in the back of Return of the King, and it's not exactly the fully a high-octane version that you get in the Silmarillion, in the Akalabeth, but it's definitely there. So they could go back thousands of years, and we'll learn about the creation of the rings and all that mischief. Some of the ground. Yeah. I'm kind of stoked about what might happen. I'm very, very encouraged, actually. I remain optimistic, although a lot of people were boo and hiss at the idea of Amazon making any TV series out of anything Tolkien. But there will be quite a vacuum in the marketplace when Game of Thrones goes off the air. Doug, any comments on Game of Thrones and their composer, who's been such a successful part of their show?
Sure, yeah, I think they've done some live shows with those scores as well, or not live to projection, but they've done live selections of the music and all that. It's nice to see that sort of thing continuing on. It's a massive undertaking. As the world of film and the world of TV begins to overlap more and more, and it's funny because you're right. Everyone does see like, oh, they're going to do this for TV. There's going to be some rinky-dink production. That's not the case anymore. These things, they're interchangeable with films. I mean, Scorsese's next film is going to debut on Netflix. So it's I don't even know if I can say it's a fine line. It's an infinitely blurred line at this point. And it's nice to see that music is remaining a appealing part of some of these television productions that do share cinematic ambitions. And I hope that music remains a part of that, as this, I don't know if you consider it a new art form or just a new distribution form, or I don't know what, but as it sort of finds itself creatively and in terms of productions, I hope that people will remember what music adds to the local theater can be added to the home theater just as well. So I hope it remains a strong point.
Indeed. I want to also say the Silmarillion is most famous for its creation myth being based in music itself. And is it no surprise then that there is so much attention being paid to the music of Middle-earth when all the fans know that even that in Professor Tolkien's original spirit, this entire universe, this whole secondary world, is created on harmony and disharmony from those godlike beings that would become the Valar. So that, to me, is the ultimate mortar between the bricks. There's a deeper, maybe subconscious understanding among Ringer fandom that music plays a bigger part in this world than anything else.
Well, I think there's a description in there, too, about how the world is the creation of intertwining themes and all that sort of thing. I'm sure I'm getting the language wrong, but I thought that was such a great turn of phrase, given how Howard's score to the now 6 films turned out. That too is a production or the product of interwoven and interrelated themes. Some discordant, some consonant. It's a kind of a cool coincidence, I think.
Doug, I think you could spend hours and hours talking about the history of film music. Tell us about this podcast that you tweeted about. Are you doing a podcast?
Yeah, so we're just starting to dip our toes into this. It's something I'm doing with a wonderful friend and kind of creative partner of mine named Jim Ware. We began working on a podcast series that we're leaning toward the name Leading Tone, which has musical meaning for those who happen to be musical theorists out there. But we wanted to do sort of our own spin on some of these scores that we consider the what are the classic film scores? And, we can name the classics of pop music and the classics of opera and symphonies and everything else. And so we wanted to see, can you establish a sort of standard repertoire of film music? And if so, is there something to be discussed in it rather than just go, well, this scene was cool, there was happy music, and this scene was kind of cool, there was sad music. We wanted to try to talk about some of the history of what these scores might have been related to, where did some of these ideas come from, and what do these things actually, technically what's happening, but without it being too jargon-based. So we did sort of a test run on an Indiana Jones one, just to start with something that we thought would be fun to work with. and
Cool.
put that out there. And so that's out on SoundCloud right now. I think it's a link on my Twitter. I think I have it pinned to the top. And it's hopefully something we can make a recurring series coming up sometime this year. We've got a couple of episodes in the can, but we're sort of just putting out our feelers right now to see what people think. So hopefully that's become something. There's also been a little discussion of doing possibly some video work on this. I did work with a wonderful filmmaker a year ago. He's the filmmaker behind that the prequel Strike Back documentary. And we may do some of these podcasts may have some video elements to them where we can get into things from a little bit different angle and make some cool stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of pokers in the fire right now.
Excellent. That's really cool.
Tired.
Doug, but for someone who is so erudite, I have to say it is a remarkable thing to have someone so erudite and well spoken, so articulate on our show. And I like to see you further. That wonderful talent you have for sharing your knowledge and making it digestible for people to listen to you and understand music theory and the way that you illustrate things in person when you're at a convention. No one like you at a show, Doug. It's really great to have you.
Thanks.
And it's great to have you as part of our extended family at the One Ring. And thank you for being with us on the show today, man.
Check in on the message boards every once in a while, see if anybody's any musical questions. Yeah.
Tell the folks where they can follow you on Twitter and Instagram, etc.
Twitter, I'm Doug Adams Music, and I think that's really my only real social media thing at this point. I'm not on Instagram. I've never set up an Instagram. I still have the website at good old musicoflotr.com, which we've used quite a bit to promote the book over the years. It's a little bit dormant right now, but if Hobbit begins picking up speed, and if anyone wants to make an Amazon extension of all this stuff, I'm sure we'd be able to post some more stuff there. But Twitter is where I'm most active these days.
I'm going to show the folks at home this beautiful, big, deluxe, super deluxe copy, special edition of The Hobbit Unexpected Journey. And inside this beautiful gatefold book, what's that? Oh, hey, somebody's got their signature in the back of the book. It says Doug Adams right there with these beautiful liner notes right there. I can barely see it, but there you are. There you are, sir. Oh, yeah.
Oh, The Empire Strikes Back?
Yeah, let's see that. There you go.
I got it.
How many autographs you got on that?
Showing up here, too. Yeah, that's the whole cast from the first two films and the filmmakers and composer, of course, and all that sort of thing, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, this is the room where most of everything in the last couple of years, last 4 years, has been written. So all the liner notes. Well, not all of them. I guess the first one I did in a different office, but this one, the last couple of Hobbit liner notes and the Hobbit book and all that was all created up here, trying to force myself to concentrate.
I love it. That's like your creative sanctum sanctorum.
Quite right. Quite right.
Yes. Dr. Stephen Strange has one. Doug Adams has one too.
Right. That's right.
I tell you what, when I was before we close the show, I have to say that I spent a lot of time wandering through different motion picture soundtracks while Fellowship of the Ring was in production. And literally all three films were concurrently in production. But in my early career with the OneRing.net, I was writing articles. We were all speculating, what the heck is this New Zealand zombie meister? What is he going to do with our favorite story by Tolkien? What the hell is going on? And I kept speculating, and the closest I ever got to, trying to find a sound, an epic tapestry of a very large, epic scale fantasy fable, the closest I could get to what I thought I wanted to hear was Joe Hisashi's score for Princess Mononoke. Because it's not a very Japanese-sounding score. Miyazaki directed Hisashi to make something very Western sounding. And that's why, you're familiar with that music, Doug.
Right. I got a number of his scores. Spirited Away is another favorite of mine. Yeah.
It's wonderful. But yet there's something that has broad, sweeping sounds and big violins and big, like, pull the camera back. We need a big wide shot of mist and clouds rolling across the mountains. And since Miyazaki and Hisashi were giving us that epic feel, I thought that might be the closest we could get to Lord of the Rings perfection. And then here comes Howard Shore a year and a half later, and it was so surprising and so cool that I hate to say it, but Howard Shore outdid some of the highest expectations that some of us hardcore fans had. And, I might complain about Faramir taking Frodo and Sam all the way to Osgiliath, which should have never happened. I might still complain about that, but I will never, ever complain about the gorgeousness and seamless, absolutely seamless thought that Mr. Shore brought to the music of Middle-earth. It was always spot on, always perfect. And I envy you, good sir, having been in the middle of that creative vortex at that time. I envy you. It's great. It's great to have you with us on the show tonight, too.
It's great to be here. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, we should make a pitch to Netflix and, like the history of film scores, something awesome.
I'm over it. I'll do it. Sure, absolutely.
Right? I'm going to send an email to Michael Pellerin, the guy who does all the appendices for the extended editions, and we'll see if we can get somebody together to do this. It would be great, wouldn't it? You guys, if you want to follow Doug Adams Music on Twitter, everybody who's watching us tonight on many platforms, we say thank you for all the chatters who came and gave us lots of questions on the hotline and all the live chat. And Justin, thank you for being the Wizard of Oz behind the green curtain and pulling all the levers tonight. Thank you for that. Are you still there, Justin?
He pulled the last lever. He's gone.
He's pulled the last lever. He's not gone yet. We've got to close the show. I mean, this has been a really great show, actually. I love talking with you. Doug, you're welcome back here anytime, even though I know you're super busy. But
sure, pleasure. Yeah, we'll do it again sometime.
Well, with time permitting, I would love that very, very much. Okay, before we go, what's your impression of The Last Jedi? Did you like it as much as I did? I thought it was brilliant. I saw it 6 times.
Did you see it? I haven't done that, but I was quite a fan, actually. I like that it toyed with expectations. It was the first time I'd seen that many new things and sort of gasped out loud for a number of years in one of those things. Those were the type of stuff that I grew up with. I was a kid from the 70s and 80s growing up with all that stuff. So it's great to see some of the old characters back, and, I'm there for the music anyway, so it's great to hear the John Williams stuff. I think it's, he outdid himself, which is a very cool thing.
He did. When he revisited Leia's theme at the moment when brother and sister are together, and he just hit that, the waterworks just started. I couldn't help it.
He's got one really theme in there that's back from Return of the Jedi. He wrote a theme for brother and sister, for Luke and Leia. And the theme hasn't been heard, I think, since the bridge sequence back in Return of the Jedi. So it was nice to have him.
Yeah, where they're standing on the Ewok bridge talking to each other.
Yeah, right.
That first disclosure to each other of who they are. Right. Yeah, I love that. That's great stuff.
You kept that one a little bit. Very cool.
That's hilarious. I'm officiating a wedding this Saturday. It's a Star Wars wedding, and everybody's in great costumes. All the members of the wedding party are Sith. The bride is Padme. The groom is Anakin, and they got me dressed as Emperor Palpatine. I've got this big black robe, and I've got all these amazing costume pieces to put together to be in an evil black, I'm going to crack all these jokes during the ceremony. And what's really funny is I had a conversation with the groom today, and he told me what music cues they're using during the wedding, and they're brilliant. They're brilliant. When I come out and I appear, the Emperor's theme will be there. And when bride and groom are together, they're going to play Across the Stars from Attack of the Clones.
Okay.
Which is played when Anakin and Padme actually get married,
Sure. Wow, a prequel-themed wedding. That's...
Well, the best man is Kylo Ren, so they're bringing in all the new stuff.
Oh, okay. Are they really doing the whole thing? All right.
Yeah, the whole thing. It's going to be crazy. I'll take pictures. We'll share them next week, okay?
Oh, yeah, very good.
All right, everybody follow myself at Twitter and Instagram at QuickBeam2000 and follow Doug Adams at Doug Adams Music there on Twitter. And that is so awesome. Thank you, everybody. Justin, you want to say goodnight to the folks at home who are on the chat? There you go. Good night. Doug, so great to have you. And we'll be back next week. Torn Tuesday, every Tuesday afternoon, live at 5 p.m. Pacific time. And Doug, thank you again, brother. Always good to see you. Stay warm.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Send some good weather this way.